What if God went silent? Right when you needed him the most. Not when life is easy. Not when the sun is shining, and your prayers feel heard. But in the moment when your world is falling apart. When your heart is broken. When your soul is screaming for answers. And heaven says nothing. This is not just a question. It's a reality many people live in. You've been there. Praying. Crying. Begging for just one sign. But instead, you're met with silence. A silence that doesn't comfort. It cuts. It confuses. It makes you wonder if you ever heard him at all. Today, we walk into that silence. Not to escape it, but to feel it. To understand it. And we won't do it alone. We'll walk with a man who knew silence better than most. A man who was good, blameless, faithful. And yet, he lost everything. His name was Job. The book of Job is not a fairy tale. It's not a sweet story with clean answers. It's a raw, brutal look into the heart of suffering. It begins with favor. And crashes into devastation. Job is introduced to us as a righteous man. A man who honored God, feared evil, and lived with integrity. A man deeply blessed, with family, wealth, and respect. And yet, he becomes the center of a cosmic conversation. A test. A battle. One he never asked for. God speaks of him with pride. Satan questions his loyalty. And so begins the silence. God steps back. And Job is left to face the wreckage of his life. With no explanation. Imagine losing your children in a single day. Imagine your body covered in sores. Imagine your friends turning into judges. And worst of all, imagine crying out to the God you love. And getting no reply. Can you feel it? That aching space between prayer and answer. We call it silence. But it screams louder than words. Job's story is not just ancient history. It's ours. It's yours. Because whether we admit it or not, every believer walks through seasons where God seems distant. Where the heavens feel shut tight. Where the silence becomes unbearable. But here's the promise of this journey. We're not just here to observe Job's pain. We're here to walk through the ashes with him. And maybe, just maybe, find in his suffering a mirror for our own healing. So let's begin. Let's walk through the ruins of Job's faith. And perhaps find the blueprint to rebuild ours. Pain is one thing. But pain without explanation, that's something else entirely. Job's story doesn't waste time. In just a few verses, everything collapses. One messenger comes running, breathless. Your oxen and donkeys were stolen. The servants are dead. Before he finishes speaking, another arrives. Fire from heaven burned the sheep and the shepherds. Then another. The Chaldeans took your camels. And finally, the blow no parent could survive. A great wind struck the house. All your sons and daughters are gone. Can you hear the silence now? Not just from heaven, but in Job's own home. A home once filled with laughter, music, prayer. Now echoes only with absence. Then, as if grief wasn't enough, his body breaks. Painful sores cover his skin. From the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He sits in ashes. He takes a piece of broken pottery. And begins to scrape himself. Can you picture that? A man once surrounded by wealth, by family. Now alone. Naked. Bleeding. Scratching his wounds. In the dust of what used to be his life. And heaven still says nothing. This is not just tragedy. It's divine silence in the face of it. The kind of silence that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Where is God? Why is he quiet? What did Job do wrong? But the text tells us, Job was blameless. This wasn't punishment. It was something else. And that, something else, makes us uncomfortable. Because deep down, we want a God who's predictable. If I do good, good things should happen. If I pray hard enough, give enough, believe enough, God will come through. But Job shatters that belief. And suddenly, we're left with questions no sermon can answer. Have you ever prayed for healing, and watched things get worse? Have you ever begged God for help, and all you got was silence? Job knows that feeling. And that's why his story still matters. He doesn't fake it. He doesn't smile through the pain. He grieves. He weeps. He curses the day he was born. But he never lets go of God. Even when it seems like God has let go of him. That's what makes Job remarkable. Not that he was perfect. Not that he had answers. But that he stayed. In the ashes. In the silence. In the unbearable, unexplainable pain. He stayed. Because maybe faith isn't proven when life is good. Maybe it's proven when life makes no sense at all. Job's suffering didn't come with a reason. At least, not one he ever understood. And that's important. Because sometimes there isn't an answer. Sometimes the diagnosis never makes sense. Sometimes the betrayal is never explained. Sometimes the silence from heaven stays silent. And yet, we live. We breathe. We cry. And we wait. This chapter of Job's life wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A beginning of questions, of pain, of confrontation. And ultimately, of transformation. But we're not there yet. For now, we sit with Job. In the ashes. Not trying to explain it. Not rushing to fix it. Just being honest. That sometimes, life hurts. And sometimes, God feels far away. But maybe, just maybe, that's when real faith begins. Have you ever prayed in the dark? Not just with your eyes closed. But with your heart shattered. Your soul trembling. And every word feels like it's floating into a void. That's where Job is now. The pain didn't end. The silence didn't break. But Job kept talking to God. He didn't pretend. He didn't hold back. He cried out, raw, unfiltered, unashamed. Listen to his words. Why did I not perish at birth? I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil. These aren't polished prayers. They're not the kind you'd post on a wall or sing in a song. They're messy. They're bitter. They're real. And maybe that's what real faith looks like. Not a sanitized version that hides the hurt. But a faith that bleeds. Job's prayers in the dark aren't about getting answers. They're about holding on. Even when everything screams to let go. He says things like, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Can you imagine that? A man who feels completely abandoned. Still choosing to believe. Still reaching for the very God he thinks might be behind his suffering. That's not weakness. That's courage. That's a faith not built on comfort. But on commitment. A faith not proven by blessings. But by battle scars. You see, it's easy to worship God when life is good. But worship in the dark, that's something else. That's holy. Because it costs something. Maybe you're there now. Maybe your prayers feel heavy. Maybe your nights are long. Maybe the silence has gone on too long. And you're tired. You're confused. You're angry. If that's you, you're not alone. Job prayed in anger. He shouted. He questioned. He begged. And not once did God rebuke him for it. God didn't say, "Be quiet." He didn't say, "Have more faith." He let Job feel. Because real relationship with God isn't about pretending. It's about presence. Even in pain. Especially in pain. Job's story teaches us something powerful. That honest prayers matter. That raw prayers matter. That broken, weeping, barely holding it together prayers are sometimes the most beautiful. Because they come from a place of truth. And God meets us in truth. Not in perfection. Maybe you felt like your faith isn't strong enough. Because you cry. Because you question. Because you feel afraid. But what if that is faith? What if true faith isn't loud and confident, but whispering, "God, help me," when everything feels like it's falling apart? What if faith is just choosing not to walk away? Job didn't walk away. He didn't have answers. He didn't have comfort. He didn't even have hope, some days. But he had one thing. He kept the conversation going. He didn't let silence end the relationship. He didn't let suffering end his pursuit. He prayed in the dark. He worshipped through his weeping. He reached, when it hurt to reach. And that is a faith the darkness cannot defeat. Sometimes the worst pain doesn't come from the suffering itself. It comes from the people who are supposed to help, but don't. Job was already broken. Physically. Emotionally. Spiritually. And then, his friends came. At first, they did something beautiful. They sat with him. In silence. For 7 days and nights. They saw his pain. And knew words wouldn't be enough. And in that moment, they were doing the right thing. Because sometimes, the greatest gift is just being present in the pain. But then, they opened their mouths. Eliphaz. Bildad. Zophar. Each one took turns offering what they thought was wisdom. But it wasn't wisdom. It was judgment wrapped in theology. They told Job, "You must have sinned. That's why this is happening. God is just. So if you're suffering, it's your fault. Repent, and maybe he'll fix it." Can you imagine? Already shattered. And now accused. Already abandoned. Now blamed. These men weren't enemies. They were his friends. But they had a view of God that left no room for mystery. No space for suffering without reason. They believed in a transaction. Good people get good things. Bad people get bad things. And since Job's life had collapsed, he must be guilty. That theology still lives today. We see someone going through pain. And we ask, what did they do wrong? We think if we pray enough, serve enough, give enough, we can earn protection from pain. But Job proves otherwise. His story exposes that kind of thinking for what it is. Shallow. Cruel. False. Because suffering isn't always punishment. And blessings aren't always proof of favor. Sometimes, pain has nothing to do with guilt. And everything to do with the unseen purposes of God. Job pushes back. He pleads his innocence. He says, "I haven't done what you think I've done." But the more he defends himself, the more his friends double down. They aren't listening. They're lecturing. And that's the danger of a rigid religion. It cares more about being right than being compassionate. If you've ever been told your suffering is your fault, let Job's story free you. If you've ever been blamed for your own brokenness. If someone looked at your pain and used God's name to explain it away. Know this. God rebukes the friends. Not Job. In the end, it's Job who prayed for them. It's Job who had God's favor. Because even in his questions, even in his rawness, he was real. And God honors real. Job teaches us what not to say. To someone who's suffering. Don't rush to explain. Don't assume. Don't try to fix what only God can restore. Sometimes the holiest thing you can say is, nothing. Just sit. Be present. Be kind. That's what Job needed. That's what so many people still need. Not a sermon. Not a diagnosis. Not blame. Just someone willing to say, I don't understand it either. But I'm here with you. Job's friends thought they were defending God. But in the process, they misrepresented him. Let that be a warning to us all. God doesn't need defenders. He wants reflectors. People who carry his heart. Not just his words. People who offer grace. Not judgment. People who stay. Even when nothing makes sense. Then, after all the silence. After all the pain, the questions, the weeping. God speaks. But not the way we expect. Not with comfort. Not with clear explanations. Not with an apology or a list of reasons why. No, he answers Job, with a storm. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. A whirlwind. God didn't whisper. He thundered. And yet, in that roar, was presence. Job had begged for a response. Now he has it. But not the one he imagined. God doesn't say, let me tell you why your children died. Let me explain why your body was covered in sores. Let me justify your loss. Instead, he asks questions. Dozens of them. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Who shut up the sea behind doors? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? God paints a picture. Of creation. Of cosmos. Of mystery. He takes Job on a tour of the universe. The stars. The storms. The mountain goats giving birth. The wild donkeys running free. The Leviathan, untamable and fierce. What is God doing? He's not humiliating Job. He's not avoiding the pain. He's expanding Job's view. Because sometimes, when life collapses, we shrink our world to our suffering. All we see is our pain. Our questions. Our wounds. And God doesn't ignore that. But he lifts our eyes. He invites Job, and us, to see beyond the rubble. To glimpse a bigger story. Not a logical answer. But a deeper revelation. You see, Job had been asking, why, God? But God was showing him who he is. Not a cruel puppeteer. Not a distant judge. But the God of stars and storms. Of birth and behemoths. Of mystery and majesty. A God who governs the chaos. Yet still hears a broken man's cry. That's the power of this moment. God didn't owe Job an explanation. But he gave him something better. His voice. His presence. And in that encounter, everything shifts. Not because Job's questions were answered. But because his heart was awakened. Because when God speaks, even if he doesn't explain, he reveals. And revelation is deeper than information. Maybe you've been waiting for God to answer your why. Maybe you've begged for a reason, a breakthrough, a sign. But what if he wants to give you something greater? What if, instead of answers, he gives himself? What if the voice in the whirlwind isn't shouting to silence you, but to remind you that he's still here. That he hasn't left. That the silence wasn't absence. That the storm isn't the end. That there's a deeper reality, holding your broken pieces together. That your pain doesn't get the final word. He does. In that whirlwind, God restored the order of Job's soul, before he restored anything else. Because what Job needed most wasn't answers. It was awe. Not logic. But love wrapped in glory. Not clarity. But connection. And maybe that's what you need too. Not to understand everything, but to be reminded. You are not alone. The God of the storm still speaks. And his voice still brings life. Job's story reminds us. God doesn't always answer how we want. But he always answers how we need. Not with a spreadsheet of reasons, but with a whirlwind that carries his presence. And that changes everything. When the whirlwind settles, when the voice of God quiets, Job is left standing in silence once again. But this time, it's a different kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of awe. Not confusion, but clarity of soul. After God speaks, Job doesn't argue. He doesn't demand anything else. He simply says, "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42 verses 3 and 5. That line, that sacred confession, is everything. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job had believed in God. He had worshipped, obeyed, sacrificed. But now, after the suffering, after the silence, after the storm, he sees. Not with physical eyes, but with the eyes of the soul. He encounters a deeper reality. Not the God of tradition, or theology, or second-hand stories, but the God who meets a broken man in the dust of his despair, and speaks with glory in his breath. Job is transformed. Not because his pain made sense, but because God made himself known. Not because the wounds were explained, but because they were touched by presence. This is what real restoration looks like. It doesn't start with getting things back. It starts with being brought back to God. Before Job's wealth returns, before his body heals, before anything is fixed externally, something eternal happens internally. His soul is reordered. His faith reshaped. He no longer needs the answers, because he's seen the answer. He's met the one who holds the questions. And that is enough. Maybe that's a word for you right now. Maybe you've been waiting for life to return to normal, for the healing, for the breakthrough, for the explanation. But what if the real miracle isn't what happens around you, but what happens in you? What if the greatest healing is when your soul stops demanding and starts resting? What if the presence of God is not just a comfort, but a cure? In the end, God does restore Job's life, his health, his family, even twice the wealth he had before. But make no mistake, that's not the climax of the story. The real restoration happened when Job said, "Now my eyes have seen you." Because the presence of God isn't a reward for making it through the trial. It's the very gift that carries you through it. Maybe you're still in the middle of your own whirlwind. Maybe your world is still upside down. Maybe nothing makes sense right now. But listen closely. God is near. Even now. Not always loud. Not always in the way you expect. But he's there. And he's not waiting until the storm ends to come to you. He's walking with you through it. Right now. Job was restored. Not by getting all the answers. But by meeting the one who is greater than every question. Let that truth sink in. Let it be your hope. Because you may not understand the why. But you can still trust the who. And sometimes, that's all the soul really needs. And so, the story of Job comes to a close. Not with thunder. Not with fireworks. But with a whisper. A whisper that speaks louder than pain. Louder than loss. Louder than every unanswered question. Job never got a full explanation. He never received the why that so many of us long for. But he got something greater. He saw God. And in seeing him, he found peace. Not the kind of peace that ignores the scars, but the kind that honors them. The kind of peace that walks out of the fire. Not the same, but somehow more whole. Because this is what real faith is. It's not believing when everything makes sense. It's believing when nothing does. It's holding on. Even when heaven is silent. It's praying. Even when the answers don't come. It's trusting that even in the silence, God is still speaking. Job's story isn't just about suffering. It's about survival. It's about a man who lost everything, but somehow held on to something deeper. And maybe that's your story too. Maybe you've walked through your own valley. Maybe you're still there. Maybe the silence feels deafening. But hear this. The silence doesn't mean he's gone. Sometimes, the silence is where he's closest. Sometimes, God isn't trying to explain himself. He's inviting you to experience him. To see with your soul what your eyes can't. To stand in the ashes of what was. And believe in what still can be. Because the faith that survives the silence is the faith that changes everything. It's the faith that can look into the darkness and say, I don't understand, but I still believe. It's the faith that rises from the ruins and whispers, even now, God is good. It's the faith that doesn't run from questions, but finds God in the middle of them. This is the kind of faith that doesn't just survive storms. It's forged by them. So, what about you? Where are you in your story? Are you in the whirlwind? The silence? The ashes? Wherever you are, know this. God sees. God hears. God is near. And the same God who met Job in the dust is ready to meet you too. Right here. Right now. If this message has touched your heart, don't walk away quietly. Subscribe to this channel. Not because we have all the answers, but because we're seeking truth together. And if you know someone who's walking through a hard season, someone who needs hope, someone who needs to know that they're not forgotten, share this video with them. It might be the word they've been waiting to hear. May God speak to you, even in the silence. And may you discover, like Job did, that his presence is always enough.